If you clicked on this video, perhaps you're feeling stuck and looking for some musical advice to move forward. Maybe you have the opposite problem. You've received too much advice and you're now feeling overwhelmed by the options before you. Or maybe you're simply skeptical of what I have to say today or anything I could share that would be meaningfully different from any musical advice you've received prior. Well, regardless of how you found yourself watching this video today, the advice I have to share with you was revolutionary to me when I first heard it because of how simple it was and how applicable it was to all the different musical styles I was interested in. This piece of advice is not a silver bullet. It won't save you any work, but it will save you a lot of time and mental energy and hopefully some frustration. Before I divulge this piece of advice to you, I'd like to give you some context on my own musical journey and how I got to the point where receiving this advice meant so much to me and helped me break through to this next level of my musical development. Before we move on, it would mean a lot to me if you hit the subscribe button below. It really helps me continue to make these videos for you and bring you quality musical instruction. Thank you so much. Jazz was the first style of music that I started taking seriously in my teenage years. When I was 16, I totally got the bug and I started trying to learn everything I could about the music. I found some friends at my high school that already had some experience with jazz and improvisation and started bugging them with questions and having them show me everything that they knew about the music. There wasn't this presence of professors or teachers yet. It was just about bugging people and ask them to slow down and show me that chord or show me that lick again so I could get it under my fingers. It was just a great time of being hungry for knowledge, but not quite yet having the expectations of mastery or command or proving to anybody that I knew anything. This period of my life was also great because I was getting a lot of immediate feedback on my playing from people I was playing with. The musicians I was playing with, even though they were young, weren't shy about when I was doing something inappropriate musically or how I could improve. It was a really functional, practical time of my life where I was just receiving information and trying to improve. And this information was coming from trustworthy sources like the musical experiences I was having and my friends that I was making through this musical community. I really fell in love with jazz and developed a passion for the guitar and for performance, so I decided to take my studies to the next level and pursue it at the undergraduate level at the University of North Texas. North Texas was a very competitive environment, but luckily I found a good supportive cohort of people to come up with, and a lot of these people are still close friends and musical collaborators. Undergrad was the first time I was exposed to musical systems of learning, really systematic ways of looking at learning voicings and scales and harmony as it applies to jazz improvisation. So I was immediately asked to learn a lot of music and a lot of musical concepts that I hadn't been exposed to before. At the end of each semester of college, there was some sort of culminating examination where I was being asked to display some knowledge of scales and chords and certain improvisational devices, many of which I just totally crammed because I was being asked to learn so much every semester that there was just no way I could actually take the time to process musically why I should learn any of these or how I can apply them to my music. And therein lies the main drawback of an undergraduate program like this, where before I really had a command of the major scale, I was being asked to learn harmonic major and harmonic minor and all these exotic sounding scales just so I could sound more advanced than I really was. There's one thing that happened constantly in undergrad, which was students saying that so-and-so sounds like insert jazz legend. So-and-so sounds like Michael Brecker, so-and-so sounds like Mark Turner, so-and-so sounds like Metheny or Frizzell or Schofield. And that was something that would happen all the time, and back then it was a compliment because as a young player, all you want to do is sound like your idol. Whereas when you grow up and grow out of that, it's kind of an insult to say that you sound exactly like someone. It sort of suggests that you haven't found something original to say. But back then, it was a high compliment. And in retrospect, looking back at that, I think what people were identifying were, oh, you've mastered this lick, or you've sort of hinted at the tone of this person, and you're pulling it off. You're suggesting the sound of this great jazz musician that you look up to and clearly have learned a lot from. Which begs the question, what does it mean to sound like somebody? Is it enough to play their licks or mimic their tone? At that age of 18 to 21, when students are in undergrad, there's really no way that they truly sound like Mark Turner or Michael Brecker or Pat Metheny, unless they're total virtuosos, which does happen from time to time. But what young ears are picking up on is just the superficial aspects of someone's sound. When young musicians compliment each other by saying, oh, you sound like this and this, or you sound like so-and-so, although it's meant as a compliment, it does display a lack of nuance and actual understanding of what the difference between these two musicians are. I remember when I was first starting out, I had an Ibanez Artcore arch top and I rolled the tone off. I used the pick just like Pat Metheny did with the flipped flat side up, and added some reverb to my amp and really thought that I sounded like Pat Metheny. Like I was convinced that I'd done it. But again, we have a way of tricking ourselves into hearing our sound and hearing where we're at as being a lot further along than we actually are. I think at the age of undergrad, a lot of students, and myself included, lack the nuance to be able to ask the questions of, are my phrasing and time as solid and as deep as these legends? Are my compositions as clear as these amazing composers? Or is my sense of harmony and phrasing and accuracy as clear as these legendary improvisers? Despite having grown a lot and made a lot of important friendships in undergrad, I still look back on that time with a little bit of hesitancy and, maybe regret is a strong word, but a sense of I could have gone deeper. And I think that that's natural to the undergrad experience where you're learning a lot of music and you're forced to develop your identity and your sound. And there's this temptation to think that at the end of the 4 years that you've arrived somewhere and that you've mastered something, which is really not the case. And actually an unfair expectation to set of anyone after 4 years. After finishing my undergrad, I moved to New York briefly, and then more finally moved to Seattle, Washington, where I began life as an artist and musician. My time immediately after my undergrad was a response to all the academic work I'd done, where I launched myself more into artistic pursuits and applying all that I'd learned in school to songwriting, composing, and improvisation. During that time, I was practicing less. I was more focused on producing material and creating recordings and getting my bands off the ground and participating in the local music scene. There's been many phases in my musical life of pushing and pulling away from practicing and disciplined work. And this is definitely a moment in my life where I didn't feel as passionate about practicing, didn't feel as passionate about traditional jazz and playing standards. And I was more interested in developing my own identity away from all that and seeing what I had to offer to a contemporary music scene. After several years of participating in Seattle's jazz scene, I caught wind of an opportunity that was opening up at the University of Washington in their jazz studies division. I'd always looked up to the musicians that taught there, Kung Vu and Ted Poor, and even Bill Frisell for a time, so I jumped at the opportunity to audition for this program. For 2 years, I studied with Kung Vu and Ted Poor, which radically changed my outlook on music and really gave me a new lease on practicing and gave me so many new perspectives on developing my artistry. There was one professor, Steve Rodby, who I got to study with indirectly through my peer, the great bassist Abby Blackwell, and that is at the center of what I have to tell you today and the piece of advice that I'm going to share with you. Steve Rodby is the longtime bassist in the Pat Metheny group. I actually used to watch this video all the time. It's the Pat Metheny group playing How Insensitive, and you can see Steve holding it down in this video clip here. Steve told me a lot about what it was like to work in the Pat Metheny group, and in addition to performing in the group as a bassist, he also edited a lot of the live concert footage, which you can see in a DVD called The Way Up. Steve is a very meticulous individual, which is evident in his playing, but also in his mixing and editing approaches. I'm sure that Steve developed this level of precision from working under Pat, who, as a band leader and guitarist and composer, is an incredibly detailed and organized musician. And now, the big reveal of the piece of advice that I've been keeping from you all these long minutes. In lessons with Steve, it was common for him to have his bass around as well. Even though the lessons were mostly him listening to us play, he would have his bass around to play for us from time to time and illustrate examples. During one lesson in particular, Abby and I were playing through one of her songs where I was leading the melody and she was playing the groove. We played it, improvised on it for a while, and ended the tune, and Steve started giving us some feedback. Steve's feedback came in the form of him pulling up his bass and playing the bass line that Abby wrote, just with slightly different inflection and rhythmic nuance. Steve asked me to take a turn and play with him and play on top of what he was providing as the foundation to illustrate the difference between how he was playing it and how Abby was playing it prior. Even though Steve's adjustments were minor, he didn't change any of the pitches or any of the rhythms. He just changed the rhythmic inflection and the dynamic nuance. It made a world of difference to the feel and to the musical implications of the piece. This was the first time that in a lesson I'd been able to compare so clearly between something that was already very good and something that was truly excellent, just in shifting really small dynamics and inflections. This was a big moment for both of us participating in the lesson, but it was even bigger when Steve stopped playing and sat us down to share this piece of advice, which can be summed up to, can you tell the difference? Now that may seem like a really simple piece of advice, but it was radical to me. It means that all musical improvement can be summed up to, can you tell the difference between where you're at as a musician and where your ideal is? Can you tell the difference means, can you tell the difference between where you're at and where someone like Wes Montgomery is at, or someone like Ornette Coleman, or Joni Mitchell, or Blake Mills? Like, I'm just listing my heroes now, but these are the people that I aspire to be as great as, and my ability to tell the difference between how I play and how they play gives me the delta that I need to address in order to achieve that level. Can I, as a guitarist, tell the difference between a solo that I take over the Days of Wine and Roses and a solo by Wes Montgomery over the Days of Wine and Roses? Can I tell the rhythmic inflection, the melodic intent? Can I tell the difference between what I'm producing and what a giant like Wes is producing? Or even on an emotional level, if I write a song and I put it next to a Joni Mitchell song, is there the same emotional resonance? Is there the same lyrical quality and clarity? These are things that you need to be able to compare in an honest way in order to make any progress. I could give myself a pass and say, well, obviously I'm nowhere near the songwriter that Joni Mitchell is. She has all these amazing talents that I probably don't have. But at the same time, if we're not comparing ourselves and getting rid of the pedestals and the glory and the legend and all that stuff, and just comparing two things side by side, if we're not able to do that, then it's going to be hard to make actual progress. Let's look at some practical examples that might come up during your daily practice or in your musical life where you can apply this piece of advice. Can you tell the difference? In the context of jazz improvisation and soloing, you could take a solo on a B-flat blues by a giant like Hank Mobley or Wes Montgomery and compare it to a solo that you've taken on a B-flat blues. This is why it's important to record yourself often, especially when you're playing tunes or gigs live, so you can go back and compare these recordings to the ideal that you're striving for. When you've found these two examples to juxtapose, go down the line of important elements of musical improvisation. Rhythm, time, tone, melody, all of the things that make music interesting to listen to. If I compared my solo on a B-flat blues to Hank Mobley's solo on a B-flat blues, I might notice that while I'm over here playing a lot of like fancy 2-5-1 stuff, Hank Mobley has a lot of catchy, bluesy riffs that repeat in a motivic way from chorus to chorus. I might also notice that while I'm playing mostly down the middle of the beat, Hank Mobley is really pulling back at some points and creating a lot of interesting rhythmic tension that I'm not creating. This isn't supposed to be an exercise in just being negative toward yourself, but it is about being honest about like how exciting the ideal is and where you can make up some of that ground by incorporating some of the techniques that they're using to accomplish that excitement and bring it into your playing. With composition and songwriting, the same truths apply. My personal goal with compositions and songwriting is to develop some sort of emotional effect on the listener or create some sort of world. My favorite compositions are like TV shows or movies that I love. I don't want to turn it off. I just want to keep it on loop and live in the world of that composition. When I compare the songs that I write to people like Cass McCombs or Blake Mills or Joni Mitchell or Bob Dylan or whoever it is that I'm really feeling that day, I've always noticed differences in the emotional resonance, in the production, in the mix, and all of these things matter when you're listening to a piece of music. So this has led me down a path of learning the chord progressions from the songs, noticing the forms, noticing the timbres that they're using, and trying to adopt those into my music. I try not to be overly negative towards myself. I try to keep it nuanced so that I'm not just dunking on myself all the time. But when it comes to a guitar part, maybe my guitar part, while it's being played well, has some extra fat or has some extra information that doesn't need to be there, that is more clear in another example of a great piece of music that I've found to compare to. This means wrapping my ear around emotional effect, production, mix, the form of the song, all the things that make the song feel like what it is. It can be a very sobering experience to compare yourself to the greats because we often just compare ourselves to our peers or people within our own level. But really, anyone will tell you that's achieved that level of greatness that the only way to really achieve that is to compare yourself and be around people who are much further along than you are. It's not out of arrogance or self-aggrandizement that I'm comparing my work to Bob Dylan or Joni Mitchell. It's actually just to hold it up to the ideal standard. It's like I have a rock that I found on the ground and I'm comparing it to the diamond, like just being able to see the two next to each other. When it comes to mixing and production, this is why I think using a reference track is really helpful. There's even plugins out there that allow you to bring a track in to compare your mix to it in real time. Being able to clearly see on an EQ how much low end or high end a recording has versus what you have can be really helpful when you're working towards an ideal. Our ears and our memory can sometimes deceive us and make us think that we're closer or further away than we really are from a source that we're going for. So it's important to keep examples close that we can refer to when we're practicing, when we're mixing, or producing something. I think the piece of advice I shared with you today is helpful because it doesn't require a specific context to be applied to. It just requires curiosity and honesty from you as the developing musician to be able to confront your weaknesses and strengths in juxtaposition to whatever ideal you've set for yourself. I hope this video is helpful for you today. Please let me know any thoughts you have on the topic. It's always great to hear from y'all. See you next time.